Placement U.S. History exam. We're here with Jasont, Stacy, and Matthew Ellington, who are going to help our students prep for this test. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Well,
morning.
This is the first year we've done the U.S. History Cram for the exam for the advanced placement test here on C-SPAN. Well, the first question everybody wants to know is, what is changing this year for this test because of the coronavirus pandemic?
Well, there's quite a bit that's changing this year on the exam. Probably the biggest change is it's a shorter test. This test will be only about 45 minutes long, and it's going to be an online test for students. In addition, it's just one document-based essay question with 5 documents. And finally, it's a take-home, it's an exam that students can take at home from their computers. So in this era of distance learning, College Board has really modified the test while still keeping the same skills that students need to be successful. And finally, this test is an open note test. College Board is not going to try to prohibit students from using their notes, so students may refer to notes as they take this exam.
That's right, Matt. And I think it's really exciting the change they've made in that they've kept the document-based question. You know, the DBQ in a lot of ways is the crown jewel of this test. It allows you to show off your writing skills, your ability to make arguments, to interpret documents, and to bring in all the good information that you've learned this year. It's important also to remember that this year it's a modified time period that will be covered, concentrating on period 3, which starts in 1754, and ending in period 7, which ends in 1945.
Now, we're going to open up our phone lines for high school students only. We want high school students to call in with questions about the test or questions about U.S. history for our distinguished teachers here. So if you have questions about the test, or if you want to attempt one of our practice questions on air this morning, we want to hear from you as well. So high school students only, we're going to open up regional phone lines. That means that if you are a high school student in the Eastern or Central time zones, we want to hear from you at 202-748-8000. If you are a high school student in the Mountain and Pacific time zones, and you have a question about the test, you have a question about U.S. history, you have a question about how you should answer this question, we want to hear from you at 202-748-8001. Once again, Eastern Central time zone, 202-748-8000. Mountain Pacific time zones, 202-748-8001. Now, gentlemen, I was looking over some of the questions for this test, and the first question that immediately popped to mind is that since this is an essay test, how much are you expected to write?
Well, that's a great question, Jesse, and the amount you're expected to write is enough to answer the question. There is no number of words that are required. You should expect to write an essay that's multi-paragraph and has a clear argument, and that argument is probably going to be proven through a number of paragraphs. You should plan on having an introduction, and if you have time for it, a conclusion.
That's right. All essays are graded on a rubric, so students need to make sure that they are familiar with the rubric and that they're writing in such a way so that they can accomplish the various tasks and demonstrate that they've learned the skills that are being asked of them on the APUS history exam. But nobody's counting words, nobody's counting pages, nobody's counting characters.
That's right.
Now, you said that this test will be taken by students at home. Tell me, can you take this at any time at home, or is there only a certain time period that the test will be open for students at home? Will everyone be taking it at the same time, or will everyone be taking it at different times?
Oh,
Go ahead, Matt.
This test will be taken by everyone across the world at the same exact time. It's going to be given Friday, May 15th at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific time, and whatever local time people are. So for folks in the U.S., it won't be bad. For folks overseas, they could be testing at very odd hours. College Board is doing this to ensure that the test can be as secure as possible.
That's right. And as I understand it, there's a number of ways in which students can record their answer. They can write it in a Word file or some sort of text file and turn it in as a file that they upload. They can handwrite it and take a picture of their responses and upload those with a phone. Or they can even, I believe, write into a text box that the College Board will provide. They can type it right into a text box and provide their response that way.
Now, what is it students will see they can base their essay on, and how long will they have to write this essay and get it submitted?
Well, students will click on their exam ticket. It will open up their exam. College Board strongly recommends that students log in 30 minutes prior to the exam because there will be some security screens and some questions that they have to answer to verify their identity. When the exam begins, students will see the full question. So they'll see the directions, they'll see the 5 primary source documents that go with that question, and then there'll also be the submission window that students can use to either cut and paste, as Jason was mentioning, or they can attach their document to that.
Well, we have some students waiting on the line right now to talk to you, gentlemen, or perhaps to try one of our test questions. Let's see. Let's start with Julia, who's calling from Montclair, New Jersey. Julia, good morning.
Hi, Julia.
Julia, are you there? We seem to have lost Julia, so let's move to Sarah, who's calling from Bay City, Michigan. Sarah, good morning.
Good morning.
Morning, Sarah.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi.
So, Sarah, do you have a question about U.S. history, or do you want to try one of our sample questions and see how you would write your essay?
I have a question. How long is the exam this year, and what's the format for it?
So,
Okay.
Sarah, it's 45 minutes you'll have to write, and it's just one DBQ that you're going to answer, and that DBQ is going to have 5 documents.
That's right. So this exam is basically a shorter, more condensed version of the traditional AP exam. It's the same skills. It's everything that you would have learned in your class, but you're only going to have one DBQ to show what you know on this exam.
Now, a question for both of you gentlemen. Now, do only high school seniors take the AP test this year, or can juniors take it as well? Who's taking the test?
It's
Actually,
usually...
go ahead,
Matt.
Jason. Oh, I was going to say,
Let's try you, Jason.
Teachers, we love to talk.
Yeah.
It's anyone who is signed up for the test who's in high school. It's usually high school juniors who take this test, but often seniors take it. And I assume a school could even have sophomore class of AP US history or students that age who have signed up. I don't believe there's a designated age as long as the students are in high school. Usually it's juniors who take this exam.
that's correct. My classes are all junior classes at my high school, and most high schools I know test juniors.
Now, here's a question for you. Are either one of you suggesting that any of your students wait until next year to take it, or are you saying just go ahead and do this? Let's start with you, Matthew.
Absolutely not. I don't recommend waiting because there's a lot of content that students need to remember, and that's a long time to go because those students will not be enrolled in AP US History next year. So I definitely recommend that students take the exam this year. As I said, it's the same skills as on the regular exam. It's just shorter and in an online format.
That's right, Matt. I agree. If you've prepared for it, if you've spent all this time in your classes, reading your textbook, practicing your essays, learning the information over the course of this academic year, the real reward is to take the test. And the College Board has made a great choice in choosing the DBQ as being the feature that they're going to keep in this unusual year, because the DBQ allows you to show off all of the skills, your knowledge, your ability to make arguments, your ability to interpret documents. That DBQ is going to allow you to show off all that work you've done.
Let's talk to another one of our students who's calling in. Let's talk to Selma, who's calling from Cambridge, Maryland. I'm sorry, Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Morning, Thelma.
Selma, are you there?
Yeah.
Good morning.
Good morning. My question is, what is meant by the revolution of Reconstruction, and what are good points to get the extra complexity point on the essay if we are asked about radical Reconstruction or the revolution of Reconstruction?
Let's start with you with that question. Jason.
Well, I'll start with the first part of the question, and I'll go to Matt for the complexity point, because he's got a lot of good stuff to say about it. The revolution of Reconstruction is in reference primarily to the amendments that come after the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. 13th Amendment, of course, abolishing slavery in the United States. 14th Amendment establishing civil rights that will be protected by the federal government against state powers, specifically those in the former Confederacy that are oppressing African American populations in the South, and the 15th Amendment that grant voting rights to African Americans, ideally throughout the United States. However, it's important to keep in mind that there is a lot going on the ground during Reconstruction after the Civil War, between the time periods 1865 and 1877. And a lot of what's going on the ground, especially in the South during that period, is running contrary to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. So it's important to keep in mind that the so-called revolution of Reconstruction has a very, very mixed legacy. By the end of that time period, African Americans, former slaves in the South, former enslaved African Americans in the South, are finding it very difficult to acquire their own land. Many of them are in sharecropping contracts that reduce them to a situation where they're permanently in debt to landholders, many of whom are former slaveholders themselves. And also, especially by the end of Reconstruction and even into the 1880s, voting rights are being curtailed in the South for African Americans through terrorism, organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, and also through local legislation like grandfather clauses and literacy tests that prevent African Americans from fulfilling those rights that they helped acquire in fighting the Civil War on the side of the Union, and that the Republican Congress sought to instill and place into the Constitution through that 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment.
Jason's right. If you remember even a fraction of what he just said, you're going to earn that complexity point. Complexity is College Board's attempt to reward a more sophisticated essay. If you look at the rubric, the complexity point is given for qualifying or modifying an argument. Now, there are some tips that we can give you to maximize your chances at earning the complexity point. In the textbook that Jason and I wrote called Fabric of a Nation, we outlined a 3-step strategy called GEM, because you want to write a gem of an essay. This acronym stands for Generate Nuance. You want to use more sophisticated language like Jason used in talking about not just the successes, but also talking about the limitations of Reconstruction, how it applied differently to different groups, what did and did not work. The second part of that strategy is to explain both sides of the reasoning skill. College Board frames their essay questions around one of 3 reasoning skills: causation, comparison, or continuity and change over time. All 3 of those reasoning skills actually have 2 sides to them. Causation is cause and effect, comparison is similarity and difference, And continuity and change is obviously continuity and change. And so one of the tips to earn the complexity points is to make sure that if the prompt only calls for one side, for example, if it said evaluate the extent of change, right, in terms of reconstruction, you would also want to talk about some of the continuities, some of the things that don't change. The third part of the strategy, the M, is to make connections across time. So for example, you could connect Reconstruction and the unfulfilled legacies of the 15th Amendment to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. And your concluding paragraph is oftentimes a great place to do that. Readers are looking for evidence that you've done these kinds of things. And so if you take a multi-pronged approach where you are taking several attempts at trying to earn the complexity point, you're going to greatly increase your chance of getting that point on the rubric.
What is the grading scale, Matthew, on this test? When you get your results, what can you tell from the score that is on the test?
Okay, the grading scale is similar but a little bit different than it's been in years past. Traditionally, the rubric has been a 7-point rubric for the document-based essay question. This year, because that's the only part of the exam, College Board has expanded that to 10 rubric points. However, all the skills and the tasks are still the same. College Board will then take your essay score. In the past, they would have taken your essays scores, plural. They would have also taken the short answer multiple choice. This time they'll just take the essay score and they will translate that into an overall AP score. So what students will see, what colleges will see, will be an essay score on the scale of 1 through 5. Generally, most colleges will accept a score of 3 and above, though there are some that are a little bit more strict and require 4s, and there are even a few that will accept scores of 2 and above. Usually on the AP exam, a slim majority, 52, 55%, will earn a 3 or above on any given year to make them eligible for college credit.
Let's go back to another student who's waiting online, who's waiting for to come in. Let's talk to Miles, who's calling from Fayetteville, North Carolina. Miles, good morning.
Good morning.
Morning, Miles.
Hey, Miles.
Miles, do you have a question, or do you want to try one of the questions that we have prepared here?
I have a question, and it's more about the testing.
Go ahead, then.
All right, so I was just wondering, like, how do I say it? With all the people taking the test at the same time, there shouldn't be a chance that the server or website should go down, is there?
Oh boy, Miles, I hope not.
There's no chance, Miles.
Okay.
I hope not.
But do make sure that you've got enough bandwidth on your end. If you've got siblings or family members that are heavy streamers, heavy gamers, right, and your internet is a little bit more limited, you're going to want to ask them to pause what they're doing so that you've got the bandwidth to be able to upload when you're done writing your essay.
Miles, are you still on the line?
I think Miles has already dropped off.
Okay.
Now, I want to look at one of the questions, or one of the documents that may show up in some form, maybe not on this test, or maybe showed up before, and I want you to tell us what your student is supposed to do once they see this. Okay? So here's something that a student could see on as an example for one of these tests. This is a North Carolina contract from 1882 that says, to everyone applying to rent land upon shares, the following conditions must be read and agreed to. The sales of Evercropper's part of the cotton to be made by me when and where I choose to sell, and after deducting all they owe me and all sums that I may be responsible for on their accounts, to pay them their half of the net proceeds.
Good.
Now, Matthew, okay.
Yes.
Just go ahead and tell us what you should do after you read that document.
This is a great document. This is very much the kind of document that students may see on the APUS history exam. So there's several tasks that students should complete when they see a document like this. The first task is to ask themselves, what is this document really about? And of course, sometimes the title will tell you. In this case, it's a sharecropper's contract. And so they should ask themselves, what do they know? What do they remember about sharecropping? Where does that fit in the historical timeline? And most importantly, how does that relate to the exam? There's 1 point on the rubric for using 2 of the 5 documents in a simple descriptive manner, essentially being able to summarize that. So even if a student is somewhat limited, most students can read and can summarize. So that's the first task that students want to do. But ideally, students want to connect that document to an argument. So depending on what the essay question is, students want to use that document to move their essay forward to support whatever point or points they're making. And then finally, students also want to complete the task of sourcing. There are up to 2 points possible on the AP exam this year for the DBQ for sourcing a document. Sourcing is College Board's way of asking students to think like an apprentice historian. Can they examine and analyze the document in one of 4 ways? By looking at and discussing the document's historical situation, in other words, the context around the document, by identifying the intended audience, who was the document for, and how does that help us understand the document? By looking at the author's purpose. What was the goal? What is the author trying to accomplish in this document? Or by looking at the point of view that's being expressed in this document.
That's right. And there's a few strategies to approaching these documents that I think are important. And I imagine you've talked about these in your classes with your teacher. But Jesse, could you one more time just read that first line after the word source in that document?
After the word source.
Yeah, it should say source, or what's the title of it that they've put there? I can't see the
North Carolina
document.
Contract 1882.
Okay, so sometimes when we have a document in front of us and it's written in a language that's over 100 years old and we start reading it, it gets very intimidating, the language in which it's written. It's not the way we normally speak to each other today. And also it's talking about something that happened a long time ago. So that it's often important not to go looking for the answers in the document at first. It's often important to take a look at that source line that Jesse just read. So notice here you've got the word contract and you've got the date 1882. And this provides you some clues as to what the document is likely going to be about. So you probably remember a few key dates from your class. You don't remember all of the dates that you've heard this entire year, and that's okay. But some of the key dates, for example, the years of the Civil War. And our first question today about the Revolution of Reconstruction between 1865 and 1877. And if you have 1865 in mind as the end of the Civil War between 1861 and 1865, you know that this is a post-Civil War document. And with that in mind, you can begin to recall some of the important pieces of information and the broad context of the time period in the generation after the Civil War. And if you look at that word contract, it may trigger in your mind the sharecropping contracts that you recall from class and that I talked about very briefly at the beginning of today, where former enslaved African Americans who are newly freed found it very difficult to acquire land, primarily because, except for a very short period after the Civil War, many of the governments in the former Confederacy are controlled by those who want to prevent formerly enslaved African Americans from acquiring property and civil rights. And many former African American slaves found themselves in these sharecropping contracts where they were effectively forced to rent land and pay for that rent with a portion of their crops, which sent them into a cycle of debt, which made it almost impossible for them to ever acquire land and often even leave the places where they were currently working the land. so that in that first line, you can begin to have a sense of what this document might be talking about. And then when you begin to read the document, you can begin to think, all right, well, who is actually talking in this document? Could it be a formerly enslaved African American? Could it be a white landholder? And there's a portion in there where the writer or the speaker is talking about what is owed to me. And this should clue you in that this is probably a white landholder who is creating a contract for formerly enslaved African Americans. And that contract is probably not going to be to those people's benefit. And this begins to bring in all of the information that will help you get those extra points on the DBQ. The point of view of the speaker, the context in which it's being written, and all that good historical apprenticeship that you've been trained over the last year to begin to make this document work for your argument.
Let's go back to our phone lines and let's talk to another student. This will be Julia, who's calling from Montclair, New Jersey. Julia, good morning.
Hi. So I know there's a lot of information and time periods covered on the test. So how do you recommend studying those, and are there any online resources, and what specifically should we focus on when we're going through our notes and studying?
Let's let you take that one, Matthew. We'll start with you.
Sure. That's a great question, Julia. As Jason has already mentioned, College Board has narrowed the focus of the test a little bit this year. So the test will be somewhere between 1754, which is the beginning of the French and Indian War, and 1945, which is the end of World War II. There are a lot of resources online to help AP students, both from the College Board, and there are other resources, both commercial and that teachers have put out there as well. But let me give a plug to AP teachers across the country, because rather than simply going out and buying a review book or finding additional resources, I think that many AP students already have everything they need from what they've done in the course during the year. So I would encourage you to consider using some of those resources, those lecture notes, the homeworks or the outlines that you've done in your class, and then strategically supplement them with resources that you find online that are helpful. One resource in particular I want to call out is the concept outline from the College Board. If your teacher hasn't shared this with you, you can find this at the College Board's website. You could simply Google Concept Outline APUS History. It'll come right up. For periods 3 through 7, which are the time periods covered on this year's test, that's about 15 pages of content that the College Board says, here are the essential concepts. These are the enduring understandings, the big picture ideas, sprinkled with a few specific terms and events that we believe you need to know. So one good strategy is to go through that concept outline. Make sure that you understand those concepts. Make sure that you can explain those concepts. Make sure that you could provide a couple of examples for each of those. And really, really make sure there aren't any terms or even any vocabulary words in those 15 pages that are unfamiliar to you. Because if they are, you've got time between now and the exam to familiarize yourself with that. That is really, in my opinion, the ultimate study guide for the APUS History exam.
And the great thing about that concept outline is it also includes in each section, broken down by subsections, very clear tasks that an essay question could ask you to do, to analyze things, to describe things, to explain things, so that not only is it just information for you to stare at and try to memorize, which is never necessarily a great way to study for this test because you have to do so much analysis and argumentation, but to have a series of tasks that it asks you to think about. And so when one of those sub-questions asks you to describe or explain or evaluate, you could even just take out a sheet of paper and take that particular question and just test yourself and how much you remember from that particular section. And then after you've done that, you can go back to the concept outline and see some of the information that they have there to support that question they've embedded.
Let's talk a little bit about time management for this test. Now, I teach a graduate level writing class, and one of the things that I always insist before I get any essay from anybody is an outline. Do you suggest that the students taking the AP test spend time writing an outline of their essay, or do you suggest they get right into it? And how long should they study the photo or study the contract or the paragraph before getting into the writing portion? Matthew, we'll start with you with that one again.
Absolutely. Time is of the essence on this year's AP exam. Students have less time than they've ever had before. 45 minutes to read, think, outline, and most importantly, write this essay, and then about a 5-minute submission window. College Board has actually said you've got 50 minutes total, not a second more than that. So as much as I would love for students to be able to fully outline, there's not time for that. Maybe a brief, quick outline, jot down your main points, plug in the documents, plug in your outside information, but then you've got to go because, as Jason said, you want a multi-paragraph, 3, 4, 5 paragraph essay, and you need the time to submit this essay electronically to College Board all within 50 minutes. So time is really of the essence. Students need to move quickly, and it's only the written essay that's going to be graded, not the outline.
So I used to instruct my students to read the DBQ question first and to maybe take a minute or two to think about how they would answer that question if it were just an essay question without documents. Now, I'm interested in Matt's opinion on this, if he would support that as well. I found that sometimes my students would read the question, they would not really think about what the question is asking or how they could answer it. And then they would immediately go to the documents to try to find the answer. And oftentimes, in that panic, the documents would confuse them more than guide them. I actually think that some of the answer to a question will already be in your head before you go to the documents. So that I would encourage you, instead of doing an extensive outline, as Matt suggested, very difficult to do in the amount of time you're going to have to write it, just take maybe a minute or two to think about the question itself and to think about how you would answer it without the documents. And I think you'll find that many of the documents will fit into an argument you've already generated just by looking at the question at first. Matt, what do you think about that idea?
Absolutely. That's the same advice that I give my students, because the fear is that if you just jump into the documents without doing any thought whatsoever, you'll forget some of the outside information that you know, and you're liable to write an essay about the documents. Remember, this essay needs to be about the essay prompt. There's an old joke that goes around AP teachers that AP should stand for answer the prompt. That's more than just summarizing and writing about the documents. So Jason's right. That's excellent advice. Do a little bit of a quick brainstorm. Think about how you might organize your argument. Try to develop 2 or 3 categories, and go ahead, if they've given you the categories in the prompt, use those categories. And even if they haven't, remember that the prompts are based on the reasoning skills. So if it's a causation essay, just ask yourself, what are 2 or 3 causes or 2 or 3 effects if it's that side, and make sure to do the same if it's continuity and change, or if it's comparison, which is similarity and difference.
You know, and something else Jesse's question brings to mind is that after you've taken that step where you've looked at the question and you've thought about some possible answers, and you've maybe even generated the beginning of an argument, maybe jotted down a word or two to help you remember it, when you then go to the documents, keep in mind that when you're looking at the documents, they will help trigger outside information that you'll want to bring in on your own. So for example, if we look at the first document we talked about today, the sharecropping contract from 1882, once you've thought about that source line where you see the word contract, you see 1882, you start thinking about the time period, then you've gone into the document itself and you've looked it over, you've read it, and you've concluded, okay, this is a white landholder who has created a document for formerly enslaved African Americans. You then begin to realize some of the information you already know that isn't in the document itself, and you may want to jot that down next to the document. You might want to write down sharecropping, which is not in the document itself, and I think could qualify as an example of outside information, especially if you briefly explain that system as part of your argument. If the word Reconstruction is not in the question itself and it is not in the document, to bring in Reconstruction or the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, all of these are examples of outside information that you will recall by taking a look at the documents themselves. So instead of thinking about putting together a complex outline before you begin to write, do that quick response to the question that you think might be appropriate, and then when you go to the documents, jot down next to those documents some of the outside information that comes to mind, looking at that source line and then reading the document itself.
And if I can just piggyback on that, and extend that thought even farther, when Jason's talking about writing outside information next to the documents, on the rubric, there's 2 points possible that students can earn for outside information. That's 2 out of 10, that's 20%. But there's another category on the rubric as well, the sourcing category. And in the sourcing category, one of the ways that students can get credit is by explaining the historical situation or the historical context of a document. And sometimes students wonder, how can we do that? That sounds hard. It's actually one of the easier skills, I think, in that sourcing category. And the way students can do that is exactly how Jason explained. It's connecting the document to a specific piece of outside information in the time period that helps explain what's happening in that document. So outside information, if students are generating it, or even if they're looking at their notes and reminding themselves of a little bit of it, that can help them in multiple ways improve their score on this year's DBQ.
Let's let another student jump in here, and this is going to be Haroon, who's calling from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Haroon, good morning.
Hi.
Good morning, sir.
Go ahead.
Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning. As you said, we have a maximum time limit of 50 minutes, and I took a timed DBQ, and I realized I'm going over the time limit. So what would your advice be if I'm have like 10, 15 minutes left, and I can't remember a concept, I just don't know what to write down, and what I do?
Let's start. You go right ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's a great question. And a lot of students, including some of my students, are struggling because this year, even though they've reduced the number of documents, they've also reduced the amount of time. It's not easy to write a full DBQ in simply 45 minutes. I would be stressed and struggling under those constraints. So here's my advice to you. Look at the rubric, and also look at yourself and look at what you've accomplished. And when I say look at the rubric tells you how the essay is going to be graded. So one of the strategies that you can do is to ask yourself, how many points am I on track for, and what can I let go of? For example, there are 5 documents on this year's exam, but in theory, you can earn 9 of the 10 points by only talking about 2 documents if you do them well and meet all the other criteria. So one strategy might be that you shorten the number of documents that you talk about. Maybe you only discuss 3 documents more in depth instead of trying to cover all 5 documents. Yeah. Conversely, another strategy, if you struggle with the sourcing component, but you feel like you know how to integrate these documents well into your essay, then you could do that. You could go for all of the documents, but then let go of the sourcing. So you're going to have to kind of look at what you've done and what you're able to accomplish, and then make some strategic choices as the test is going, which is why it's so important to practice this ahead of time.
And to that point, Faroum, about running out of time, this year in particular, there will be a great temptation, because it is OpenNote, to go to the internet to try to find something you can't remember, to go to your notes and flip through them and try to find that one date that you know is in there somewhere, to go through the index of your textbook. I want to stress just because it's open note, don't get pulled into trying to find a particular fact or a name or an argument that you know might be somewhere in the sources that you have. That will eat up more time that can be better spent on using the strategies that Matt just mentioned, sticking to what you know and what you remember, using the documents that you can apply to the fullest. Don't be tempted by the fact that it is open note, because it is also a very limited amount of time. And you can spend 5 or 10 minutes trying to research one small thing, and then you'll find, even if you find that thing, you'll have used time that could have been better spent making a broader argument, finishing that paragraph, establishing some context, or interpreting a few more documents.
Let's go to another student. This is going to be Tom, calling from Buffalo, New York. Tom, good morning.
Morning, Tom.
Good morning.
Hey, Tom.
So my question is, what would you say that the most challenging aspect of this format of the exam is compared to the previous format?
Take that one, Matthew.
Sure, I'll take that one. I think the answer is going to depend a little bit on each student. I think for a lot of students, it's going to be the fact that it's timed, but also that it's online. So my students have been practicing handwritten timed writes throughout the year, and then all of a sudden, with the move to distance learning and with the new exam this year, it's an online format. So again, I think that it's critical for students to practice their typing, practice submitting the essay, and of course practice the actual writing of the essay as well. Fortunately, College Board has actually opened up an exam demo. If you Google AP Exam Demo 2020, I think it's the first hit that will come right up. It's also linked directly on the College Board's website. I strongly encourage all students to practice the online process, because while many of us might feel that it's easy, if you haven't submitted an online exam before, you don't want May 15th to be the first time you do that, and without the familiarity of having already worked through the College Board system.
And Tom, I just turn it around too. This year there's a certain advantage to this format, because in years previous, by the time students get to the DBQ, they've already taken the multiple choice section and answered the short answer questions, and they've spent a lot of energy to do that, and then they have to come to the DBQ. You're coming to the DBQ fresh. So one thing to keep in mind that's a good thing about this year's format is that the DBQ is challenging every year. It requires you to use all of the skills that you've acquired over the course of the year, and now you're going to be able to hit the ground running because you're going to be able to come to that DBQ fresh.
Now let me ask this question just so we're all on the same page. We're going to look at an image here, which could be one of those source documents, and it's an image called The First Vote. It's from Harper's Weekly, 1867. It's a drawing, black and white drawing of an elderly African-American man casting a ballot. What would be the possible DBQ? What would be the question that this document would be relating to for our students?
Good.
And Jason, let's start with you.
Thanks, Jesse. That's a great document. And again, notice how important the source line is here, both the title, where it's published, and when it's published. But if we're going to talk about a possible question, I think it's important to keep in mind that in the last 3 years, 2017, 2018, 2019, the DBQ questions have started with the word evaluate. At least to my looking at the last 3 years, I believe that's correct. And so when a DBQ asks you to evaluate something, it's asking you to judge it. And you're usually going to be asked to judge something to the extent it is or isn't. So this is just one document, so that there would be 4 more, but a question could be something like evaluate the extent to which the political and economic reforms of Reconstruction ultimately helped those they sought to assist, or something along those lines. And then a student looking at this document could note that it was in 1867. So we're 2 years after the end of the Civil War. We're really at the beginning of the Reconstruction period. And at the very beginning of that period, there was widespread voting available to formerly enslaved African Americans. And here is Harper's Magazine, which students wouldn't necessarily have to know this, but this is a northern magazine published out of Boston. That here is this northern magazine showing, or at least proclaiming, that there's progress on the part of civil rights for African Americans. But of course, students are also going to keep in mind that if the question is an evaluate question, evaluate the extent to which there was progress. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is going to end up being a very mixed legacy, so that within 10 years of the publication of this cartoon, celebrating an African American man voting for the first time, in fact, many African Americans are going to find those rights curtailed.
Yeah, and I would simply add to that College Board is in the habit, as I mentioned earlier, of framing their questions around the historical reasoning skills. Causation, which is cause and effect; comparison, which is similarity or difference; and continuity and change, which is continuity and change. So another thing that students can do is to ask themselves, what does this document say about the effects of Reconstruction, perhaps on the lives of African Americans or on the political system in the South? Or how does this document illustrate one of the kinds of changes that's taking place? Or how is this similar or different to the experiences that African Americans faced before Reconstruction and the Civil War, or in a different time period?
Let's go to another student. This one's going to be Megan, who's calling from Winchester, Virginia. Megan, good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
Morning, Megan.
So I have a few questions, but I can pick one if that's all that you can take. But my first question is, how is making connections across time periods for the complexity point different from contextualization?
That's a good question, Megan. The way I tend to explain that to my students is contextualization is connecting to a broader process or topic. Oftentimes, I encourage students to do that at the beginning of their essay, to connect it to something immediately prior or at the beginning of the time period, though it can be done at the end of the essay to connect forward or even during the middle of the essay. The way I distinguish contextualization from making connections is contextualization means it's either within or it's abutting, it's next to the time period. Making connections, you're making a jump, maybe 20, 50, 100 years. I wouldn't go much farther than that. So it's not directly connected to the time period. That's one way to keep them straight.
So a good example of that with what we've been talking about today with Reconstruction is that contextualization might take into account the situation for African Americans in the United States immediately prior to the Civil War, maybe in the 1850s or the 1840s, and a complexity point might be at the end of that essay to look forward to well after Reconstruction, the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s as an attempt to redress many of the problems that came out of Reconstruction in that failed revolution.
Let's go to Will, who's calling from Buffalo, New York. Will, do you have a question for our distinguished teachers here?
Yeah. This is pretty much like the question you just answered, but I was just wondering what the importance is of comparing across eras.
Well, as we were just explaining, the importance of comparing across eras is it gives the reader another opportunity to reward you for complexity. It's one of the ways that College Board has defined for readers to assess whether or not an essay is more sophisticated, if it's more historically complex. Keep in mind, you don't need to do that. Because one, you don't have to earn the complexity point. Most years over 90% of students do not earn the complexity point. It is the hardest point on the AP DBQ to earn. Some teachers refer to it as the unicorn point. And there are other ways, such as generating nuance, explaining both sides of the reasoning skill, that you can earn the complexity point as well. But it can be part of kind of a coherent strategy to maximize your chances of success. But again, if you're running short of time, that might be something that doesn't make it into your essay.
Yeah,
go ahead.
The most important thing on your DBQ is to generate an argument and to prove that argument by analyzing the documents where you can bring in outside information and you understand the ways in which they support your argument, and following through with your argument through multiple paragraphs. The complexity point is very important, but it is not essential. What's essential is that you have your argument clear, that you bring to bear evidence to prove that argument, and that evidence be a combination of the documents that are provided, as many of those as that you can use, and outside information that you remember from class or from your reading. Much of that outside information can be triggered by the documents itself.
Here's one of the questions that a student has texted into us or sent to us on Twitter. Since the test is open note, what do you believe are the key things to have printed out and sitting in front of us for the test? I don't want to have too many things in front of me, but I want to have the most important things at easy access.
That's a great question, because it's very easy to become overwhelmed during the test. So I would recommend that you have a set of study guides, whether they are the concept outline that perhaps you've annotated, whether they're your lecture notes, whether there's some homework outlines. It's going to look different for every student, but it's important that whatever it is, it's organized and it's something that you are familiar and comfortable with. You don't just want to print something off the internet for the very first time and look at it during the exam. And keep in mind that the purpose of the notes, at least what should be the purpose of the notes for students, is it's there to refresh your memory. There is not time, as Jason said, to do any research. Now is the time, if you still need to learn something new, to go ahead and learn it. During the AP exam, it's all about reminding yourself of what you already know. So those notes can be used as kind of a quick cheat sheet to peek and refresh your memory, like, oh, that's right. I remember this event and that person and that law, and I know them, so I can intelligently incorporate them into my essay and show off everything that I know.
We have about 8 minutes left, so let's see if we can get our last couple of students who've been waiting patiently on the line to get their question in. Let's go to Kylie, who's calling from Cornelius, North Carolina. Kylie, what's your question?
Hi. I actually just got my question answered on Twitter, but I do have another question. Since there are 10 points this year, how many of the 10 points do we need to get a 5 on the exam, and what are the points that you recommend that we focus on the most?
That's a great question, Kylie. Yeah. The truth is, we don't know for sure, and College Board doesn't know for sure, because they're not going to make that decision until after everybody's taken the exam and they've read thousands of exams and they've gone through a process called norming, and they've looked at the statistics across various years. Right. But we can take some educated guesses. I think it's safe to say that you need a majority of the points to make sure that you pass. And since you asked specifically about a 5, I feel pretty confident. Well, I feel 100% confident saying if you get a 10 out of 10, you've got a 5. And I feel pretty confident that if you get a 9, you're going to get a 5 as well. But again, we won't know for sure. In theory, I suppose it's possible that an 8 could do it. A good rule of thumb might be to just go by categories: 1 and 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Those would correlate to a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's rough and that's an estimate, but that's probably about as good as we can do right now.
Let's see if we can get one more student in, and that's going to be Emily, who's calling from Orlando, Florida. Emily, go ahead.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Emily.
So my question is, I know that crunch time, everyone's going to be studying for the exam. Do you have any tips on what we should be studying or any thing that we should be looking over?
Jason, take that one.
Okay, I think a way to start is to just take the 5 time periods 3 through 7, that are in the concept outline, and to just create on a piece of paper, just list those dates so that you've got the whole period that you'll be tested on divided by those 5 time periods. And then use that list with some spaces in between each one of those time periods to jot down some of the key trends that you recall in that time period. So, for example, if you're looking at the big one at the end, 1890 to 1945, some things that are immediately going to come to mind, for example, might be the Progressive Era, the First World War and the Second World War, the 1920s. And once you've begun to write down some of these larger themes within each one of those time periods, some of the facts should begin to come back to you. And so you'll have that outline. Again, it's not going to be very detailed, but as Matt said, in the midst of the test, it's going to help remind you of what you already know. And that sheet can serve as a kind of roadmap for the whole period that you're being tested on. And you'll make that roadmap as you're doing your final preparations for the test and organizing it according to those 5 time periods that you're going to be evaluated on.
Here's a question that was sent in by a student earlier. This question comes in from Adrian, who's a student at North Shore Senior High in Houston, Texas. And Adrian wants to know what made the Kansas-Nebraska Act a key part in the Civil War.
How much time do we have left?
About 5 minutes. So,
Kansas-Nebraska Act is important for a lot of reasons. First, it's really at the end of a long process since the U.S.-Mexico War from 1846 to 1848 that reopened the debate about the extension of slavery. The Kansas-Nebraska Act opened up the territory that from the Missouri Compromise of 1820 that was closed to slavery and made possible the extension of the institution of slavery into the West north of the 3630 line or the southern border of Missouri. It effectively started the violence in the Kansas territory in 1856, where you remember John Brown, of course, and the border ruffians from Missouri are fighting it out in the Kansas territory over whether Kansas will become a slave state or not. This ultimately leads to violence on the Senate floor when Senator Charles Sumner is caned on the floor of the Senate in 1856, May of 1856. And past that, it just accelerates towards the first secession of a state in December of 1860, South Carolina. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act is significant because it is effectively the trigger for the violence that spirals into the secession of the first state in 1860 after the election of Abraham Lincoln in November of that year. Matt, you want to add to that?
There's a lot there. I would simply add that the Kansas-Nebraska Act also accelerated the demise of the Whig Party, and it led to the rise of the Republican Party, which was a regional party. The Republican Party was not represented in the South, and it's the election of the Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, without any Southern electoral votes that then prompts South Carolina and eventually 10 other states to secede from the Union.
Here's a couple of technical questions from students. They want to know your advice on this. The first question comes in from Sydney, who's calling from Pius X Catholic School in Lincoln, Nebraska. Sydney wants to know, how do you correctly cite a document? And we have another quick question I'll add into that one from one of our online followers who wants to know, will the question be same for everyone on the test?
In terms of the first...
Okay, let's start with Jason and then go to Matthew.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, to the first question, there is no official way in which you have to cite your documents. I recommended that my students cite them at the end of the sentence where they use them in a parentheses where it just says Doc A or Doc B. Matt, how do you have your students reference a document? Or Doc
That's
1,
exactly
Doc 2?
the same thing I encourage my students to do. Oftentimes, the document citation is as much for the student to keep track to make sure that they've covered the documents that they want to cover, because the reader is going to have read hundreds of these DBQs, and he or she are going to have those documents memorized quite possibly by the time they read your essay.
And really quickly, does everybody get the same question?
We don't know.
Okay.
College Board will probably not answer that. If you ask them, they would probably say that all the questions will be equivalent. My guess is, based on past history, that most students will see the same question, but they usually run several versions of the exam every year.
Perfect.
That's right.
Well, we would like to thank Matthew Ellington and Jasont Stacy, who are the co-authors of Fabric of a Nation, a brief history with skills and sources for the AP course. We'd like to thank both of you for being with us here today and helping us prep for this AP U.S. History exam. Gentlemen, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeff.